The bill arrived before the sun did. It waited on the metal chair beside Claire Rowan like an accusation, white and clean and impossible, while her younger brother slept under hospital blankets that looked too thin for what he had survived. She had been awake for 23 hours, long enough for fear to lose its shape and turn into something duller, heavier, almost practical. Practical was worse. Panic was loud. Practical sat with a pen in its hand and started calculating how many late notices a life could absorb before it finally split. Claire kept staring at the total as though one more look might make the number embarrassed enough to shrink. It never did. Across the hall, a vending machine hummed. A nurse laughed softly at some private joke. Somewhere a monitor kept time in patient green flashes. Her brother, Noah, had color back in his face, which should have felt like victory. Instead it only meant the next problem had arrived. She had gotten him to the hospital. She had signed the forms. She had promised him everything would be okay. Now she had a stack of charges and $14 in her wallet, and the cruelest part was that she still had to keep smiling when he woke up. She stood because sitting made her feel trapped, and she walked to the billing desk because motion was easier than helplessness. The woman behind the glass explained payment options in the bright, practiced tone of someone handing out umbrellas in a fire. Claire nodded as if she were a person with choices. Installments. Verification. Deadlines. Minimums. The words touched nothing. She signed where they told her, took the folder they gave her, and nearly made it back to Noah's room before her knees lost the argument they had been having with the rest of her. She pressed one hand to the corridor wall, staring at the floor's waxed shine until the blur in her vision cleared. That was when a stranger's voice asked whether she needed help. It was the kind of voice that made people tell the truth by accident. Low, steady, unhurried. Claire looked up, and the first thing she noticed was not that he was handsome, though he was. It was that he wasn't looking at her with polite discomfort or easy pity. He was looking at her as if she were still a person and not a problem leaking in public. Dark coat, midnight tie loosened at the throat, rain silvering his shoulders. He held out a paper cup of coffee from the machine around the corner. She took it because refusal required energy she no longer possessed. They spoke for fewer than 5 minutes. He asked whether her brother would recover. She said yes, because saying maybe felt like an act of betrayal. He asked whether she had eaten. She said the crackers in the waiting room counted if the law was feeling generous. A brief shadow of amusement moved through his expression, there and gone so quickly it might have been imagined. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't offer his. He didn't perform kindness loudly, the way some people did when they wanted witnesses. He just stood beside her while the hospital breathed around them and let the silence settle into something oddly bearable. Claire hated that she noticed his hands, capable and restrained, or the weary intelligence in his eyes, or the fact that he smelled faintly of rain and cedar and expensive wool. Men like that did not usually appear in fluorescent hallways at 3 in the morning offering vending machine coffee to women whose shoes still carried subway grime. When a nurse called Claire back inside, she turned automatically. When she looked over her shoulder a second later, he was gone, and the corridor had already swallowed him like a secret too elegant to linger. At dawn the miracle happened in the ugliest possible setting. A clerk from billing hurried toward her with a revised summary and a look of bureaucratic confusion. The emergency balance, the deposit, the immediate medication charges, all of it had been cleared. Anonymous payment. No, she was sorry, there was no donor information attached. Yes, the account was updated correctly. No, this did happen sometimes. Not often. Claire stared at the page until the print trembled. Anonymous generosity sounded beautiful in theory. In reality it felt destabilizing, like stepping onto a stair that ought to be there and finding only air. She went back to Noah's room and sat beside him while he slept, one hand curled near his face the same way it had curled when he was 6 and feverish and convinced monsters lived in the radiator. Relief should have washed through her cleanly. Instead it tangled with confusion, pride, suspicion, gratitude, and a dangerous, ridiculous certainty that the stranger in the corridor had something to do with it. She told herself that was romantic nonsense invented by exhaustion. She told herself the world did not arrange itself into meaning simply because she needed meaning badly. Then Noah woke up and asked if they were ruined, and Claire lied with all the conviction she had left and said no. The next 10 days passed in the brutal rhythm of people who cannot afford collapse. Claire took double shifts at the bookstore cafe where she managed morning inventory and evening customers with the same smile she used when landlords called. She refilled Noah's prescriptions, argued with him about rest, and sent out resumes after midnight until the words on the screen blurred into gray weather. Her degree in communications had become one of those facts people admired sympathetically right before explaining why they couldn't hire anyone full-time. Still, she kept trying. There was rent. There was the cost of Noah's follow-up care. There was the anonymous debt she now carried in reverse, a moral balance she could not stop feeling even though no one had asked her to repay it. She called the hospital twice more. She got nowhere. She mentioned the stranger once to Noah, who instantly transformed the story into a fantasy involving secret philanthropists, old money guilt, and a hidden camera show. Claire laughed harder than the joke deserved because the alternative was admitting that on the worst night of her year, a man she knew nothing about had seen her cracked open and quietly stepped in before she shattered. That kind of memory did not stay still. It moved around inside her, rearranging the furniture. When the interview request came from Adrian Vale, she almost ignored it on the assumption that no respectable firm wanted a woman whose recent employment history looked like a series of polite near-disasters. Then she saw the salary range and answered so quickly she nearly dropped her phone into the sink. The company was one of those names that appeared in business sections next to words like expansion, acquisition, and visionary. Corporate strategy, urban investment, private redevelopment. Money with polished shoes. The position was for executive communications support, which sounded grander than it probably was. Translation, fix documents, manage chaos, make powerful people sound human. Claire could do that. She had been making chaos sound manageable for years. The morning of the interview, Noah insisted on walking her to the train like an overprotective younger brother who had temporarily forgotten he had nearly collapsed in public. She wore her one good black dress, the one that suggested competence if viewed from several feet away, pinned her hair into submission, and rehearsed professional confidence until the words felt almost rentable. Adrian Vale occupied 40 floors of glass, steel, and air-conditioned intimidation. The lobby alone looked like it had opinions about credit scores. Claire gave her name to reception and tried not to notice how badly she fit among the tailored certainty surrounding her. Then the elevator doors opened, and the stranger from the hospital stepped out as if the building had manufactured him. For one astonished second, Claire forgot every useful thing she had ever learned, including how to inhale without looking startled. He recognized her too. She saw it in the slight pause before his expression sealed itself back into something polished and unreadable. In daylight he looked even more impossibly composed, not softer but sharper, as though the dark suit and clean lines of the office had returned him to his natural climate. The loosened midnight tie was gone. So was the gentleness that had hovered around him in the hospital corridor. What remained was command. People near the elevator straightened as if his presence edited the air. He crossed the lobby toward reception, glanced once at the schedule tablet, then back to her face. "Ms. Rowan," he said. The formal tone made the memory of vending machine coffee feel almost invented. "I'm Adrian Vale." Of course he was. Half the company name lived on his business card. "You're here for the interview." Claire managed a yes that sounded less intelligent than the average houseplant. He nodded as though surprise were a thing he allowed only in private, then held out a hand. When she took it, his grip was brief and steady, and she had the unnerving sense that both of them were pretending a first meeting had just taken place while another, truer one stood silently beside it. The interview did not feel like an interview so much as a test she had not been told she was taking. Adrian asked precise questions and listened to every answer as though deciding what kind of steel she might be under heat. He wanted to know how she handled competing deadlines, difficult personalities, last-minute edits, public mistakes, missing information. Claire answered honestly because she had long ago discovered that polished nonsense impressed exactly the wrong people. She told him she prioritized by consequence, not noise. She told him panic was contagious and therefore useless. She told him most communication problems began when someone with authority confused being feared with being understood. At that, one of his eyebrows lifted the way a better man's smile might have. "And which do you prefer?" he asked. Claire met his gaze. "Being effective," she said. Something unreadable shifted in his expression. The head of human resources, seated near the far end of the table, looked between them with frank interest, as if sensing she had wandered into a scene from a story and wanted badly to know the next page. Adrian asked nothing about the hospital. Claire asked nothing about the bill. They fenced around the truth like skilled opponents and called it professionalism. By noon she had the job. The logic of it unsettled her almost as much as the salary. Temporary probationary period. Immediate start. Direct reporting structure through the executive office. When Human Resources finished explaining benefits and security access, Claire signed everything with the strange feeling that her life had accepted an offer before consulting her nerves. Adrian passed her in the corridor outside orientation and stopped just long enough to say, "If you have questions, ask Inez." Inez turned out to be the executive office manager, a woman in her 50s with silver hair, immaculate lipstick, and the calm of someone who had watched powerful men confuse urgency with importance for 3 decades and no longer found it charming. She took one look at Claire's expression and ushered her into a side office with tea, passwords, and an unofficial map of the company's emotional weather. Jonah from legal believed deadlines were character tests. Serena in finance weaponized silence. The chairman's nephew should never be allowed near a microphone. And Adrian Vale, according to Inez, was an excellent boss if you liked competence, clarity, and the occasional sensation of being assessed by a falcon. He expects precision, Inez said. But he does not expect mind reading. That already places him above average. Claire laughed despite herself. It felt good. It also felt dangerous, because the office around her gleamed with the kind of order that punished emotional improvisation, and nothing about her private life was orderly enough to survive exposure. The days that followed taught her Adrian's habits before they taught her anything about the company. He arrived early, left late, and treated time as a resource too valuable for theatricality. His voice remained low even in disagreement, which somehow made everyone listen harder. He corrected sloppiness without humiliation, expected people to prepare before speaking, and had the unnerving gift of noticing when someone in a meeting was performing confidence instead of offering substance. Claire discovered quickly that he liked drafts cleaner than most people liked finished products. She also discovered that he remembered details. The train delay she had mentioned in passing. Noah's follow-up appointment when she requested a slightly later start one morning. The fact that she took her coffee black during the first half of the day and forgot to drink it during the second. None of these things should have mattered. Each of them lodged somewhere under her ribs anyway. The hospital memory hovered between them like an unopened letter. Sometimes she caught him watching her after a long meeting, not inappropriately, not warmly, just with the restrained attention of a man standing one step away from a line he had no intention of crossing. That should have reassured her. Instead it made every shared silence feel sharper. Outside the office, life refused to simplify. Noah recovered unevenly, which was better than failing dramatically but worse than hope deserved. The landlord raised questions about late rent with the oily politeness of men who preferred pressure to compassion. Claire's best friend Priya, a photographer with heroic opinions and unreliable sleep, declared that Claire's new corporate life sounded like a romance novel written by someone with tax problems. Claire denied this so forcefully that Priya stared at her over noodles and said, "Ah, so definitely yes." Claire did not explain the hospital stranger. She was not ready to hear the story out loud. Some truths changed shape when spoken, and she did not yet know whether this one would become ridiculous or too real. Instead she worked. She learned the cadence of Adrian's edits, the architecture of public messaging, the difference between a crisis and a nuisance pretending to be one. She stayed late without being asked. She made herself useful enough to feel less temporary. And all the while, gratitude kept curdling into suspicion, then softening back into gratitude again. If Adrian had paid Noah's bill, why say nothing? If he had not, why did his face return to her thoughts every time relief brushed too close to wonder? The answer did not arrive cleanly. It arrived in fragments. An insurance call transferred to the wrong extension. A glimpse of a hospital envelope tucked into Adrian's briefcase before he closed it too quickly. Inez mentioning, without context, that Mr. Vale donated quietly and disliked publicity around need. Any one of those things could have meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern Claire tried, and failed, not to see. She told herself she was being fanciful. She told herself coincidence was not chemistry, and gratitude was not intimacy, and a man in a tailored suit with a reputation for strategic genius was unlikely to spend much time thinking about a woman who alphabetized speech notes for him and once arrived with a run in her tights hidden under confidence. Then Adrian called her into his office near sunset to review a draft for a charity partnership, and when she entered, city light had turned the windows copper, softening the angles of his face into something too human to be safe. He glanced up, and for a moment neither of them looked away quickly enough. Whatever this was, it was no longer confined to fluorescent hallways and unanswered questions. It was here now, breathing in the space between her and the man who had either changed her life or was about to. Adrian's office should have felt cold. It was all glass, dark wood, disciplined shelves, and views of the river that made lesser people start using words like skyline in sentimental ways. Instead, the room felt lived in with the kind of restraint that invited curiosity precisely because it offered so little. A framed photograph sat turned slightly away on the credenza. A stack of paper marked with handwritten edits made his perfection less abstract. His jacket hung across one chair, proving he did, in fact, have shoulders and not merely a corporate silhouette. Claire took the seat opposite his desk and concentrated on the charity proposal open between them. Children's medical access. Community clinics. Regional funding. The subject matter tugged too directly on the bruise of her suspicion. Adrian reviewed the final paragraph, then slid the pages toward her. The message is technically sound, he said, but it's missing its center. Claire read the passage and knew instantly what he meant. The language was careful, impressive, sterile. It sounded like generosity seen from a boardroom window. She crossed out half a sentence and replaced it with something simpler about fear, delay, and the cost of waiting for help you cannot afford. Adrian watched the movement of her pen instead of interrupting. When she finished, he read silently, then nodded once. Yes, he said. That is the truth of it. Claire looked up too quickly. There was something in his voice that did not belong entirely to the document. From then on, work became the safest way to get too close. Adrian started looping her into meetings she had no formal reason to attend. At first Claire assumed he wanted efficient note-taking. Then she realized he was asking what she thought. Not as a gesture. Not to be kind. He asked because he respected the answer. It was far more destabilizing. She became the person who could tell him when a statement sounded hollow, when a public apology tried too hard to protect power, when a strategy forgot the humans who would have to live under it. Adrian never praised carelessly, but when he did, the effect was absurdly physical, as though one sentence from him could alter the temperature of an entire day. Claire hated how much she noticed the finer details now, the looseness in his posture after midnight conference calls, the rare flashes of dry humor, the way he stood slightly apart at company receptions as if attention were a tax he had learned to pay without enjoying. The more she saw, the less he resembled the kind of man gossip could flatten into labels like ruthless or brilliant. He was those things, perhaps, but he was also tired in specific ways, patient in private ones, and carrying some inward weather he never discussed. Their first real argument happened over a press release and ended up being about far more dangerous things. A contractor under Adrian Vale had mishandled a tenant relocation, and the initial draft from legal smothered responsibility under polished language. Adrian intended to soften the edges, not erase them, but Claire pushed back harder than was strictly wise for someone still on probation. "This reads like people are only regrettable when they create bad optics," she said, standing by the conference table with marked pages in hand. The room had emptied except for the two of them. Families were displaced. "If we're actually accountable, say so. If we're not, then at least don't dress evasion in sympathy." Adrian's expression went very still. "You assume I disagree." Claire met his gaze. "I assume powerful institutions become fluent in sounding humane without risking discomfort." For a heartbeat the silence tightened. Then, unexpectedly, Adrian leaned back and exhaled something close to a laugh. "That," he said, "is probably the truest thing anyone has said in this room all month." He took the papers from her hand, reread her edits, and accepted nearly all of them. The argument should have ended there. Instead it changed the air between them. Respect sharpened into awareness so fast it felt almost visible. That same week, Noah had a setback. Not dramatic, just expensive. New tests. New medication. New forms that treated illness like a subscription model. Claire kept the fear hidden under functioning the way she always did, but Adrian noticed anyway. He noticed because he noticed everything. He found her in the document room after hours, sitting on a low cabinet with her phone in one hand and a pharmacy quote in the other, fury and helplessness pressed so tightly together inside her that she could not tell which one was winning. He did not ask what was wrong immediately. He stood in the doorway, giving her a chance to lie. When she didn't speak, he crossed the room and sat on the cabinet opposite her, not too close. "Your brother?" he asked. Claire nodded. She told him the practical version. Cost. Timing. Insurance delay. The kind of language that made catastrophe sound like paperwork. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable except for one brief flicker at the mention of postponed care. "Take tomorrow," he said when she finished. Claire shook her head on instinct. He held her gaze. That was not a negotiation. It should have annoyed her. Instead it almost undid her. Before she could respond, he added, quieter, "Some delays cost more than they appear to." The sentence landed with strange force, like something remembered rather than spoken. The company gala took place that Friday in a restored bank hall that smelled faintly of polished stone and ambition. Claire attended because attendance was not technically optional and because Inez had looked at her over a pair of emergency earrings and declared, "If we are all going to suffer through donor small talk, we may as well be well dressed." Claire wore a dark green dress borrowed from Priya and arrived prepared to be invisible. That plan lasted 6 minutes. Adrian, in a black tuxedo that should have been illegal without warning, intercepted her near the entrance and looked at her for one stunned half-second too long. It was not overt. Anyone else might have missed it. Claire did not. Neither, unfortunately, did Inez, who later muttered, "Well. That seems complicated," before vanishing toward the bar. The evening unfolded in speeches, handshakes, strategic laughter, and 1,000 tiny reminders that wealth often preferred to call itself stewardship. Claire handled guest lists, corrected a caption error seconds before a video rollout, and rescued a donor from being cornered by the chairman's nephew. Adrian watched all of it with the unmistakable focus of a man who admired competence more than performance. When the orchestra began and people drifted toward the dance floor, Claire escaped onto the terrace for air. She found Adrian there already, city lights burning below them like another version of truth. "I don't usually come to these," he said. "Because you dislike crowds?" "Because I dislike being congratulated for doing the minimum decently." Claire turned toward him. "That's not the minimum." His mouth curved faintly. "You have a generous view of standards. Maybe you have a distorted one." For a moment the traffic below, the music behind them, and the cold silver night all seemed to recede. Adrian rested both hands on the stone railing, looking out rather than at her. "My sister avoided treatment for months," he said. The words came so evenly she almost missed the fracture beneath them. She kept telling everyone she was fine. By the time she stopped saying it, the choices available had changed. Claire went still. He continued, eyes on the city. Money was not the only reason. Pride. Denial. Timing. But money helped turn delay into danger. It was the closest he had come to the hospital, and though he named nothing directly, the distance between implication and certainty narrowed until it hurt. Claire wanted to ask if he had been the one. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to put her hand over his where it gripped the stone. Instead she said, "I'm sorry." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "So am I." Inside, applause broke out for some successful donation pledge. On the terrace, the silence between them deepened into something intimate enough to frighten her. When he finally looked at her, there was no room left for pretending not to feel it. Claire would later blame the lighting for how close they came to disaster on the terrace, though the truth was simpler and less flattering. She had spent weeks building sensible walls out of work, gratitude, caution, and class difference, and all of them had become paper the moment Adrian turned fully toward her. He didn't move nearer. That was almost worse. He simply looked at her with the contained intensity of a man who had made discipline into architecture and was suddenly no longer sure the structure would hold. "You should go back in," he said. It was clearly the wrong thing for both of them. Claire's pulse made an unreasonable argument. "Probably," she answered. Neither of them moved. The music from the ballroom shifted into something slower, the kind of song people use to make bad decisions appear elegant. Adrian gave a quiet laugh that held no humor at all. "MS. Rowan," he said, voice roughened at the edges, "if you stay on this terrace much longer, I'm going to stop being impressed by my own restraint." Claire should have felt alarm. Instead the line struck straight through fear and hit the part of her that had been exhausted by self-control for years. "Then maybe," she said before wisdom could intervene, "you shouldn't call me Ms. Rowan." The silence that followed was bright as live current. He kissed her hand instead of her mouth, which somehow felt more intimate and far more dangerous. His fingers closed lightly around hers, his lips touched the space above her knuckles, and the gesture landed with such old-fashioned care that Claire had to turn her face away to steady herself. When she looked back, he had already reclaimed distance. "Go inside," he said. This time she obeyed. The rest of the gala passed in a daze of smiling through donor conversations while privately burning. Priya later described the post-event expression on Claire's face as, "Someone who just found out longing can, in fact, pay taxes." Claire did not share details, mostly because details would have made the whole thing feel more real than she could safely manage. Adrian was her boss. Her anonymous benefactor, almost certainly. A man with a dead sister folded somewhere into his silences. A man who had nearly crossed a line and then stopped with enough force for both of them. Sleep did not help. By morning the terrace might as well have happened in another country, except her body kept remembering what his restraint had sounded like. Worse, work resumed with brutal normalcy. Meetings. Drafts. Calls. Adrian gave no sign in public that anything had shifted. In private, if their hands brushed over a file, the room changed temperature. 3 days later the truth arrived hard enough to end speculation. Claire was searching Adrian's bag for a briefing folder he had asked her to bring to a board lunch when a loose paper slipped from the side pocket and landed at her feet. She bent automatically to pick it up and froze before she stood. It was a hospital receipt. St. Catherine's. Noah Rowan's account number in the upper right corner. Beneath it, a processed payment entry. Donor authorization initials that matched Adrian's full name too cleanly to deny. Claire stared at the page until the text sharpened into insult. Not because he had helped. Because he had helped and then let her spend weeks navigating gratitude like a blindfolded person in traffic. Because he had stood across desks and conference tables from her, watched her struggle, watched her suspect, and kept choosing silence. He entered his office seconds later, saw the paper in her hand, and knew immediately what had happened. Neither of them pretended otherwise. Claire set the receipt on his desk with great care because if she moved too quickly, she might shatter. "You paid the bill," she said. Adrian's jaw tightened once. "Yes." No apology. No excuse. Just the truth, finally given shape. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because you were already carrying enough." Claire laughed then, sharp and joyless. "That's not an answer. That's a beautifully tailored evasion." He took a breath. "I didn't want gratitude to become obligation. So instead you chose secrecy." Her voice stayed low, which made it deadlier. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to be in debt to a man who can also fire me?" The sentence hit him. She saw it. "Good." Adrian came around the desk slowly, stopping several feet away as if proximity might only worsen the wreckage. "You are not in debt to me." Claire folded her arms because her hands had become unreliable. Easy thing to say when you're standing on the side of the room with all the power. He flinched almost invisibly. "I know how it looks." "Do you?" she asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you met me on the worst night of my life, decided to intervene without my consent, hired me without ever mentioning it, and then watched me work for you while pretending none of that required a conversation." Adrian's restraint cracked enough for real emotion to show through. "I hired you because you were the best candidate." "And the hospital?" He held her gaze. "The hospital was not charity." "Then what was it?" For the first time since she had known him, he seemed genuinely without strategy. "Recognition," he said at last. "And perhaps cowardice." The answer should have softened something. Instead it only revealed how much feeling had been moving beneath his silence and how little protection she had from any of it. Claire left work early for the first time since joining the company, walking 20 blocks in heels because anger needed distance more than comfort. Rain started halfway across Midtown, the kind that flattened the city into reflective gray surfaces and forced everyone into a shared irritation that felt almost democratic. By the time she reached her apartment, she was soaked enough for Noah to open the door and ask whether she had been in a fight with the weather or merely lost custody of an umbrella. Claire laughed despite herself, then burst into tears so abruptly that his expression changed from comic to alarmed in a heartbeat. She told him everything. The hallway. The bill. The job. The terrace. The receipt. Noah listened with the grave concentration of someone far too young to have acquired this much seriousness. When she finished, he leaned back against the chipped kitchen counter and said, "So basically your life is either a very romantic story or a labor violation." Claire stared at him. "That is deeply unhelpful." "I know," he said. "But accurate." Then, more quietly, "Did he make you feel small?" Claire thought of Adrian's silences, his terrible thoughtfulness, the way he had looked at her when she challenged him, the way he had touched only her hand because he understood exactly how close danger stood. "No," she admitted. "That's the problem." Noah nodded, as though this made a kind of sad sense. The problem, Claire realized as she stood in her damp dress with rain drying cold against her skin, was not that Adrian had power. It was that he had never used it carelessly, and she no longer knew which frightened her more, the imbalance between them, or the fact that despite everything, she still wanted to walk back into his office and ask him to tell her the whole truth. The office became a battlefield of manners. Adrian did not call Claire into his office unless strictly necessary. Claire addressed him with such immaculate professionalism that even Jonah from legal noticed and stopped making jokes about executive chemistry. Emails turned crisp. Meetings became safer than hallways. The strange thing was that distance did not cool anything, it only gave tension cleaner edges. Adrian looked more tired. Claire became more efficient. Between them, everyone else moved around the shape of a problem they did not understand but had begun to sense. Inez, who had likely understood from the beginning that human beings rarely keep trouble neatly compartmentalized, waited 3 days before cornering Claire in the copy room with the kind of compassion that allowed no escape. "I am not asking for details," she said, loading paper with military calm. "I am only reminding you that silence clarifies very little unless both people are already wise. Most people are not." Claire tried for a smile and failed. "He kept something enormous from me." Inez nodded. "Yes. That tends to complicate one's opinion of a man." Then she lowered her voice. "For what it is worth, he has been nearly unbearable all week, which suggests he is not enjoying the complication either." Claire should not have cared. Naturally, she did. Work refused to pause for emotional catastrophe. A regional project ran into regulatory trouble. A board member made a careless remark that nearly became a headline. Claire handled drafts, triage, and scheduling with the calm of someone who had learned young that composure was sometimes just grief wearing a neat coat. Adrian depended on her anyway, despite the distance. Or perhaps because of it. He trusted her judgment in ways that now felt almost cruelly intimate. He would slide a document toward her and say, "Tell me what I'm not seeing," and Claire would. He would listen. He would adjust. In another life, maybe that kind of respect would have been the beginning of something easy. In this one, it only illuminated the fact that trust in one area did not repair it in another. Late Thursday evening, after everyone else had gone, a power outage hit 3 floors at once, killing screens and leaving the executive corridor lit only by emergency strips low along the walls. Claire, collecting printed packets before the elevator stopped, found Adrian standing by the windows watching the city darken section by section under the storm. "Backup generators are coming online," she said, because practical facts were easier than feelings. "Good," he answered. She should have kept walking. Instead she stopped a few feet away and said, "Recognition is still not an explanation." Adrian turned. In the dim light his face lost some of its usual authority and looked, dangerously, like that corridor man again. "No," he said. "It isn't." He told her the truth without defense this time. His younger sister, Elise, had spent nearly a year pretending symptoms were manageable because the timing was bad, the cost was complicated, and pride could impersonate strength for a disturbingly long time. By the time Adrian understood how much she had hidden, he could solve the financial part but not the rest. "Money teaches people the wrong lessons when it arrives too late," he said quietly. "You begin to understand what it can fix just as you discover what it cannot." The night at St. Catherine's, he had seen Claire trying to stand upright under a number he recognized too well. He paid because he could. He stayed silent because he suspected being saved by a stranger could feel humiliating to a woman whose whole body radiated the refusal to collapse where anyone might see. He hired her because she was excellent, because the interview confirmed what the corridor had only suggested, and because by then telling her had become tangled with every other line he was determined not to cross. "I made a decision I had no right to make for you," he said. Then I compounded it by assuming distance was a form of respect. Claire listened in the blue emergency gloom and hated that honesty suited him so well. "You don't get to decide what dignity looks like for me," she said. "I know. And you don't get to hand me a life-changing secret and call it protection." "I know." The repetition, stripped of self-justification, wore down some hard corner in her anger. Not enough. But some. Then the elevators failed completely, stranding them on the executive floor until facilities reset the system. It should have been absurdly mundane. Instead it became one of those suspended pockets of time that stories build entire futures around. They waited in Inez's office because it had windows and a small emergency lantern that made the room glow amber. Rain needled against the glass. Somewhere lower in the building, generators groaned awake. Claire sat at the conference table, shoes off, tension and exhaustion making her honest in reckless ways. Adrian loosened his tie as if the dark had given him temporary permission to be a man rather than an institution. They spoke of smaller things at first. Noah's latest sarcastic remarks. Inez's secret collection of terrible office mugs. Priya's theory that expensive men always looked like they knew where to find spare cuff links. Then quieter things arrived. Claire admitted she had not felt stable in years, only efficient. Adrian admitted efficiency had become his preferred disguise. Claire said she hated accepting help because it made loss feel one step away. Adrian said control was simply grief's most expensive hobby. The line made her laugh unexpectedly, and the sound changed something between them. When the power finally returned, neither of them moved. Adrian reached out, very slowly, as if giving her time to refuse, and touched a strand of hair that had fallen loose against her cheek. "Claire," he said, and in that one word was apology, desire, caution, and something far worse than all three combined. She kissed him first. The kiss was brief because brief was all either of them trusted. It was also devastating. Adrian's hand tightened once against her jaw, then released as if even that small claim required negotiation. Claire felt every dangerous truth at once: how badly she wanted him, how much she still resented him, how impossible it was to reduce what stood between them to office policy or wounded pride. When they parted, both of them were breathing like people who had run farther than intended. Adrian closed his eyes for 1 second, then said the only reasonable thing available. "This cannot continue while you report to me." Claire almost laughed at the brutality of returning from that kiss straight into ethics. But he was right. Of course he was right. "Then don't make me report to you," she said. The challenge in her voice surprised them both. Adrian studied her, some new decision taking shape behind his expression. "There may be a way," he said. "But it would require time, discretion, and your absolute freedom to refuse." Claire stood, shoes still in her hand, heart entirely unreliable. "Good," she said. "Because I'm done with arrangements I don't get to choose." The elevator lights blinked steady over the open doors. Somewhere beyond the corridor, phones started ringing again, the world rushing back toward order. Yet as Claire stepped into the restored brightness, she knew the real storm had only just changed direction. Whatever came next would not be accidental, anonymous, or silent. For the first time since the hospital, that felt terrifying enough to resemble hope. Hope, Claire discovered, was not remotely the same thing as ease. The following week unfolded under a new kind of pressure, the sort that arrives once two people stop pretending not to want each other and still cannot safely do much about it. Adrian moved with his usual precision, but now Claire could read the effort required. Every glance he withheld became visible as an act. Every careful sentence carried the memory of his mouth on hers. He did not touch her again. He also did not retreat. Instead he met with legal, human resources, and the board's governance chair under the entirely plausible pretext of restructuring executive communications. Inez told Claire none of this directly, but one did not survive years in office ecosystems without learning to listen to the space around conversations. There was talk of a new strategic communications unit. A different reporting line. Expanded responsibilities. Claire should have felt offended that her emotional life now appeared to involve compliance architecture. Instead she felt oddly respected. Adrian was not asking her to accept risk dressed up as romance. He was trying, in his maddeningly thorough way, to remove the structural imbalance before either of them stepped further into what already existed. It was the first time since discovering the receipt that she felt something inside her unclench without permission. Then the article broke. It appeared online at 6:12 a.m. under a headline designed by a person who had likely been denied affection in childhood and chosen media instead of therapy. The piece accused Adrian Vale of masking predatory acquisitions with philanthropic branding, and while half the claims were shallow, one detail struck like a blade. An anonymous source described Adrian Vale's habit of intervening privately in employees' personal crises, implying favoritism, coercion, and blurred lines that turned private generosity into corporate leverage. Claire read the paragraph 3 times before the full horror of it settled. Someone knew. Not everything, but enough to manufacture something ugly. Her phone started vibrating almost immediately. Priya. Noah. Inez. The company crisis channel. By the time Claire reached the office, the lobby had become a museum of controlled panic. Jonah from legal looked as if he had slept in his suit. Serena was already forecasting market reactions in tones normally reserved for weather sirens. Adrian stood in the center of it all with terrifying calm, issuing instructions in clipped sentences that gave nothing away. When his gaze found Claire across the operations room, something raw and furious flashed there for a split second before composure shut over it again. He nodded once toward the conference room. She followed. Inside, the door closed on the noise. Adrian handed her a printout of the article marked with notes. "This did not come from the hospital," he said. "The billing records were private." Claire scanned the page. The phrasing was speculative, but the emotional geometry was too precise to be random. "Someone saw enough to invent the rest," she said. Adrian nodded. "Or wanted to." He told her an activist investor had been circling the company for months, pressuring the board, looking for leverage against him. Scandal did not need to be true to be useful. Claire understood instantly why this mattered beyond reputation. If the story expanded, every achievement she had earned inside the company could be rewritten as purchased loyalty. Her work would become anecdote. His restraint would become manipulation. Their one kiss, if discovered, would retroactively stain every decent choice either of them had tried to make. The realization did not make her afraid so much as fiercely angry. "Then we answer with facts," she said. Adrian's expression tightened. "Facts will not control appetite." "No," Claire said, "but they can stop the lie from choosing the frame." For one charged second, they were back where they had always been best, side by side in crisis, translating chaos into strategy. Adrian looked at her the way he had in that first interview when she said effectiveness mattered more than being liked. "All right," he said. "Then help me build the frame." They worked for 14 straight hours. Claire drafted statements that admitted what could be ethically admitted and refused the rest without cowardice. Adrian pushed back where disclosure created legal exposure. Claire pushed harder where silence would look like guilt. Inez coordinated interviews. Jonah hunted leaks. Serena tracked board sentiment with the expression of a woman measuring whether she needed to sharpen knives. In the middle of it all, Claire realized the article's source had likely come from inside the company, not outside. Someone had seen Adrian watching her too closely after the gala. Someone had noticed the new role discussions. Someone, perhaps more maliciously, had seen enough to construct a story around money and desire because those were the easiest motives to sell. The thought sickened her less than it clarified things. She had spent so long worrying about whether Adrian's original silence had robbed her of agency that she had missed a simpler truth: other people would gladly strip both of them of complexity if scandal made a better headline. By late evening, the first response went live. Clean. Disciplined. Human. No melodrama. No performative outrage. No exploitation of private medical details. Just a firm denial of coercion, a statement of internal review, and a promise that employee integrity would not be reduced to gossip for strategic gain. The market steadied. Not fully, but enough. Exhaustion has a way of making tenderness reckless. Near midnight Claire found Adrian alone in the smaller conference room, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, one hand pressed against the bridge of his nose as if he could hold the day back by force. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he sensed her and looked up. "You should go home," he said. The concern in his voice landed too softly after a day built from knives. Claire stepped inside and closed the door. "You first." He gave a short, tired laugh. "I don't appear to be winning that argument." She moved to the table, set down 2 coffees, and for a while they simply existed in the quiet aftermath together. No strategy. No legal framing. No heroic restraint. Just the brittle intimacy of 2 people who had defended each other in public all day and could not name the relief of it without making everything harder again. Adrian reached for the coffee, their fingers touched, and this time neither of them pretended it meant nothing. "If this damages you," he said quietly, "I will fix what I can." Claire's exhaustion sharpened into honesty. "You still think you can fix people by absorbing the damage yourself?" His gaze lifted to hers. "I think I can try." Claire shook her head. "That's not love, Adrian. That's penance with better tailoring." The words settled between them, too revealing to withdraw. Adrian went very still. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "And if what I feel has ceased to be penance?" Claire forgot how to breathe. He stood, slowly, giving her every chance to move away. She did not. The kiss this time was not brief. It was careful, then not careful, then careful again, because both of them understood exactly how much could be ruined by wanting without thought. His hand settled at her waist as if asking a question rather than making a claim. Claire answered by stepping closer until there was no room left for denial. When they finally broke apart, the city outside the windows looked blurred and unreal. Adrian touched his forehead to hers and said, with the weary clarity of a man surrendering to truth, "When this is resolved, I want everything honest." Claire closed her eyes. "Then resolve it," she whispered. Neither of them yet knew that honesty was coming faster, and far more brutally, than either had planned. The leak review took 48 hours and destroyed 2 careers by noon on Tuesday. The first belonged to a vice president from investor relations who had mistaken private observation for useful currency. The second, more surprisingly, belonged to the chairman's nephew, who had fed half-formed gossip to a reporter after deciding that innuendo counted as strategy if one wore a good suit while spreading it. By the time Inez delivered the summary to Claire with a face of controlled disgust, the board had stabilized behind Adrian and the article's momentum had begun to rot under its own exaggeration. It should have felt like victory. Instead it felt like aftermath, the sort that leaves everyone standing but rearranged. Human resources fast-tracked the restructuring Adrian had started. Claire would move out of direct executive reporting and into a newly created role overseeing strategic narrative and public trust initiatives across departments. More responsibility. More visibility. Better title. Independent authority. On paper, it was ideal. In practice, it felt like stepping onto a bridge while the river beneath still remembered flood season. "You can refuse," Adrian said when he explained the final structure in the conference room where they had once argued over truth in a press release. "Nothing proceeds unless you choose it." Claire looked at the documents, then at him. "I know," she said. And for the first time in this whole impossible story, she truly did. She accepted the role. The decision thrilled Noah, impressed Priya, and caused Inez to say, with grandmotherly severity, "Good. Now try to enjoy success before immediately turning it into another ethical crisis." Claire promised nothing. Work changed quickly. The new reporting line meant she saw Adrian slightly less in formally required ways and slightly more in ways that felt chosen. They began having conversations not because schedules trapped them in the same room but because both of them found reasons to remain after the meeting ended. A walk from one building to another became charged. A late email became intimate simply because of what was no longer unsaid. Yet they still held back. Adrian insisted on time, transparency, and patience that sometimes drove Claire nearly insane. "You are the only man alive," she told him one evening as they crossed a rainy courtyard after a board session, "who could make longing feel administratively rigorous." To her deep satisfaction, he laughed hard enough to lose composure for a full 3 seconds. It changed his whole face. Claire stored the sight away greedily. There were moments like that now. Bright, surprising, real. Small freedoms that made the larger restraint feel survivable. Then Claire's landlord sold the building. The notice came taped crookedly to the front entrance beside a broken intercom and a dead fern no tenant had ever successfully identified. Renovations. Lease review. Temporary vacancy provisions. The language used the familiar trick of sounding neutral while threatening people with eviction by punctuation. Noah found Claire standing in the hallway reading the paper as if hatred alone might set it on fire. "Please tell me our home is not being rebranded as artisanal living," he said. Claire showed him the line about redevelopment, and his answering silence said enough. Their neighborhood had been changing for years, old storefronts polished into places where coffee cost rent-adjacent amounts and nobody remembered the names of families who had lived upstairs for decades. Claire hated the irony almost as much as the danger. Her new role at Adrian Vale involved public trust, tenant impact, community narratives. Now her own building had become the kind of story she had been helping powerful people explain without sounding predatory. The hypocrisy scraped. Priya offered sofa space. Noah offered reckless optimism. Claire offered spreadsheets and a private panic she tried hard not to let seep into work. She failed. Adrian noticed within hours. He found her in the archive room staring at a relocation ordinance while pretending not to unravel. "What happened?" he asked. Claire nearly lied. Then she looked at him and, for once, let exhaustion win. She told him everything. Adrian's expression changed with the quiet force of a weather front crossing water. "What company bought the property?" he asked. Claire named the holding group. He went very still. Too still. "That company is tied to one of our outside development funds," he said. The sentence landed like a betrayal performed by mathematics. Claire shut the file in her hand too fast. "Of course it is." Adrian stepped closer, not touching her. "It is not a controlling stake. No, just enough to let me say I work for the machine chewing on my own front door." The bitterness in her voice startled them both. Adrian did not flinch from it. "Then let me look into the structure." Claire laughed sharply. "And do what? Quietly make the problem vanish again? You do see how we got here, don't you?" He absorbed the hit without defense. "Yes," he said. "I do." That should have steadied her. Instead rage and shame tangled harder. She was tired of being vulnerable in front of him. Tired of needing anything while he stood there capable of moving mountains if he chose. "I need a minute," she said. Adrian nodded and stepped back immediately, which only made the urge to lean into him more dangerous. When he left the archive room, Claire sat down on the floor between boxes of annual reports and let her eyes burn until the tears gave up and turned back into resolve. Resolve, unlike panic, came with tasks attached. Claire began organizing the tenants in her building that night. Translation for the notices. Contact sheets. Legal aid referrals. Meeting times. Priya photographed living conditions before improvements could erase them. Noah built a shared document and promptly turned into the world's least patient activist. Claire understood now that this was the axis on which everything with Adrian would turn. Not whether he wanted her. Not whether she wanted him. Whether the man behind the careful eyes and expensive conscience could stand on the right side of a problem when doing so might cost influence, allies, or advantage. Adrian called twice. Claire declined both times. On the third attempt he sent a single message: "I am not asking for trust. Only the chance to earn it without deciding for you what that should look like." She read the line 5 times before putting the phone face down on the table. Noah, seated across from her amid tenant forms and takeout containers, lifted one eyebrow. "That," he said, "is either infuriatingly noble or a very expensive form of flirting." Claire almost smiled. Almost. Outside, sirens braided through the avenue. Inside, her apartment smelled like soy sauce, damp radiator heat, and the beginning of a fight that would determine far more than where she lived. Whatever came next, it would no longer be enough for Adrian Vale to be kind in private. She needed to know what he would do in daylight, with witnesses, when the cost of decency had numbers attached. Adrian did not send flowers, apologies, or solutions disguised as gestures. Claire noticed because lesser men would have chosen at least one. Instead he did something far more dangerous. He showed up at the tenant meeting in a public library basement with printed ownership records, legal maps of the fund structure, and enough humility to stand near the bad coffee instead of at the front of the room. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Mrs. Alvarez from 4B asked whether he had come to measure them for luxury flooring. Noah folded his arms with the protective hostility of a younger brother who had appointed himself emotional border patrol. Priya whispered, "This is either very brave or profoundly stupid," while adjusting a camera lens. Claire felt every eye swing between her and Adrian, building narratives at criminal speed. He did not defend himself. He waited until the room quieted by exhaustion rather than charm and said, "I am here because my company has exposure to this property through an investment vehicle I should have scrutinized sooner. I cannot undo that conflict by sounding regretful. I can, however, bring the information you need to fight fairly and publicly. No corporate varnish. No gentle lies. Just fact, fault, and usefulness." It bought him exactly 8% more patience, which in that room counted as a landslide. Claire took the documents from him without touching his hand. Still, when their eyes met, something hard inside her shifted by a fraction. The campaign that followed was ugly, exhausting, and far more intimate than any romance had a right to become. Claire spent nights drafting tenant statements, days juggling her new department at Adrian Vale, and late evenings coordinating journalists, advocates, and legal volunteers. Adrian did not attempt to run the movement. He offered access, data, and institutional leverage where Claire explicitly agreed. When she said no, he stopped. It was such a basic form of respect, and yet, after everything, it felt almost radical. They worked side by side in public rooms lit by bad fluorescent panels and private conference spaces overlooking polished cityscapes, the contrast between those worlds becoming impossible to ignore. Adrian took meetings with fund managers who disliked his questions. Claire sat in when invited and watched him work very hard not to confuse influence with ownership. That distinction mattered more than any speech he could have made. He called the fund's managing partners by their correct names and their evasions by harsher ones. He asked for tenant impact projections that should have existed before acquisition. He requested disclosure language no one had wanted on paper. He pushed for delay, review, and direct resident consultation. None of it made him popular. Claire watched men twice his age smile at him across polished tables while quietly calculating how much of his conscience they could survive. In the library basement, tenants began addressing him with something only slightly less hostile than before. Mrs. Alvarez still narrowed her eyes every time he entered, but once she accepted the packet from his hand and said, "If this turns out to be a trick, I will haunt you in excellent health." Adrian inclined his head and answered, "A fair consequence." Noah nearly choked trying not to laugh. The room softened by a degree. Public pressure built faster than anyone expected. Priya's photographs ran with a local feature about quiet displacement and speculative redevelopment. Claire helped shape statements for the tenants that did not flatten them into symbols. Mr. Okafor from the second floor spoke about running his tailoring shop for 21 years without ever missing rent until the building stopped fixing heat and started pricing out memory. Two sisters from 5A talked about caring for their mother with dementia in the apartment where she still recognized the walls. Claire watched story after story cut through the clean language of urban improvement, and she understood with renewed force why words mattered. Adrian understood it too. He never tried to stand in front of the residents. He stood beside them when asked and behind them when that was wiser. Every time he deferred to Claire's judgment in public, another knot inside her loosened. Trust did not return as a revelation. It returned like circulation to a numb limb, painful, gradual, undeniable. The hearing at City Hall was scheduled for a Thursday, so hot the sidewalk seemed to radiate resentment. Claire arrived with tenant folders, media notes, a portable charger, and the sense that one wrong sentence could tip the day toward demolition or reprieve. The chamber filled early. Advocates. Reporters. Developers in quiet luxury. Residents in their work clothes because missing a hearing was easier than missing a shift only if you had never needed either. Adrian entered through a side door with legal counsel, saw Claire across the room, and did not approach. He didn't need to. The look they exchanged carried everything necessary. I'm here. I know. Hold the line. When testimony began, the opposition led with familiar claims about revitalization, underused assets, and long-term benefit. Claire had spent enough weeks in corporate language to know exactly how cruelty preferred to introduce itself. Then the tenants spoke, and the room changed. Their building became real. Its smells. Its winter radiators. Its cracked steps. Its birthdays, griefs, school mornings, and tired Friday dinners. No redevelopment prospectus on earth could compete with a life described by the people living it. Adrian was called near the end. A murmur traveled through the chamber when he rose. Everyone knew who he was, half of them wanted a performance. He gave them none. He stated his title, his fiduciary connection to the investment structure, and the fact that his company had failed to examine the human impact of the deal rigorously enough before exposure. He did not dodge responsibility into passive grammar. He did not shield himself behind process. Then he did something Claire had not fully expected even after all the recent evidence. He recommended, on record, that the city stay permits, compel a full tenant impact review, and require either preservation commitments or withdrawal from the current redevelopment path. One of the fund attorneys actually whispered his name in alarm. Adrian ignored him. Capital, he said into the microphone, is often praised for its efficiency. Efficiency is not a moral defense if what you are streamlining is the removal of people from the lives they have built. The room went absolutely still. Claire felt her pulse in her throat. This was not private kindness. This was daylight decency with a price tag attached. In that instant, whatever remained of her uncertainty about who he was gave way to something clearer and far more dangerous. The price appeared within the hour. Before the hearing even ended, Serena texted Claire 3 words from the back row: board. Emergency. Tonight. Priya, reading over her shoulder, muttered something inventive and profane about capitalism eating its own children. By 6 p.m., the executive floor at Adrian Vale felt like the deck of a ship deciding whether to mutiny. Jonah from legal looked ill. Inez looked murderous. Adrian went straight from the hearing to the boardroom without changing his tie or his expression. Claire was not invited into the meeting, which did not stop half the building from acting as if her heartbeat might somehow be subpoenaed. She stayed in her new department area, answering press inquiries and drafting a holding statement while the board argued above her. Noah texted every 20 minutes demanding updates and offering increasingly chaotic sabotage ideas involving stink bombs and amateur live streaming. Claire responded with single words that meant nothing and everything. At 9:14 p.m., Adrian emerged from the elevator alone. He looked composed if one had never met him before. Claire knew better. Exhaustion rode under his skin like fever. He crossed the floor to where she stood by the windows and said, "They want me to issue a correction implying personal conflict distorted my judgment." Claire stared at him. "And will you?" Adrian's gaze held hers. "No," the answer came without drama, which made it heavier. "Then what happens?" He gave the slightest shrug, elegant and fatal. "We discover how expensive principal is this quarter." Claire should have said something practical. Instead she stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You didn't do that for me." Adrian's expression shifted. "No," he said. "I did it because it was right. The fact that I also cannot bear the idea of you being harmed by what I failed to question sooner is adjacent, not central." It was such a precise, impossible answer that Claire laughed through sudden tears. The floor around them continued moving, phones, printers, people pretending not to witness history brushing past a private moment. Claire wanted to touch him. She didn't. Adrian looked at her as if restraint itself had become painful. "Go home," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be worse." Claire lifted her chin. "Then I'll be here for that too." For the first time all day, something like hope touched his face. It vanished quickly, but not before she saw it. By midnight, the city was still arguing about the hearing. By dawn, the board's response would make everything personal again. The board did not remove Adrian the next morning. That would have been cleaner, and boards rarely preferred clean when cruelty could be disguised as prudence. Instead, they announced an internal governance review, temporarily limiting his unilateral authority on external fund matters while praising his continued leadership during a complex transitional period. Claire read the statement twice and admired, in a detached way, how many knives corporate English could hide under a velvet napkin. Adrian retained the title, lost room to maneuver, and acquired a public halo of conditional trust that infuriated him far more than outright attack would have. They want to keep the market calm without rewarding disobedience, Serena said dryly over coffee. It's management by symbolic collar. Claire nearly smiled. Nearly. She spent the day handling media angles, speaking with tenant counsel, and ignoring the spike of private fury every time someone on television praised Adrian as a visionary reformer without mentioning the residents whose lives had forced the issue. By afternoon, she realized the next phase would be harder than the first. Public sympathy had turned the story into narrative currency. Now everyone wanted ownership of the right side. Adrian tried to stay inside the boundaries the board had drawn. Claire saw him attempting it and knew instantly it would not last. He attended meetings he despised, let investors speak too long, and answered questions about optics with a level tone that made less disciplined men visibly nervous. But every hour spent managing perception was an hour not spent fixing the actual structure, endangering Claire's building and dozens of others like it. By Wednesday night he came to her office with his tie half loosened and a document in hand. "If I sign this," he said, setting it on her desk, "the company preserves position with the fund, distances itself from future tenant displacement through advisory language, and allows the city review to continue without further resistance." Claire scanned the pages. It was clever, insufficient, and entirely built to protect everyone from full consequence. "And if you don't sign?" Adrian's gaze did not leave her face. "There is a stronger option." She looked up. "Which is?" He answered quietly. "I force a divestment recommendation, disclose internal objections to related projects, and make it impossible for them to pretend this is isolated." Claire understood at once. He was talking about detonating the polite version of the company's comfort. "And what would that cost you?" she asked. Adrian gave a small, humorless smile. "The title, perhaps. Several allies. My remaining patience for board culture. The usual." Claire stood. "Don't be glib." His expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to make this smaller than it is." "Then don't." The room held its breath around them. Claire stepped closer to the desk, closer to him. "If you do this, do it because you believe in the choice. Not because you think sacrifice is the price of loving correctly." Adrian's eyes changed at the word loving, though neither of them moved away from it. "I know the difference now," he said. "You taught it to me." He made the recommendation the following morning. Chaos followed with admirable efficiency. The board split. Two major investors threatened revolt. Business channels started using phrases like internal fracture and principal gamble. Priya called to say Adrian had somehow become the only financially literate romantic lead in New York. Noah called to say if Claire didn't marry that man eventually, he would consider it a personal insult. Claire told both of them to stop narrating her life. Neither complied. Through it all, Adrian kept moving. He authorized independent audits, met with resident coalitions, and backed a proposal that would convert several at-risk buildings, including Claire's, into protected long-term housing structures through a public-private stabilization partnership that cut profit and preserved tenancy. It was not perfect. Claire knew enough now to distrust the fantasy of clean justice. But it was real, expensive, and measurable. Which meant it mattered. When the city announced preliminary support pending final agreements, Mrs. Alvarez kissed Claire on both cheeks and informed Adrian that he remained suspicious but no longer damned. He accepted this with admirable gravity. The laugh Claire let out then felt like the first easy one in months. That should have been the beginning of relief. Instead, Adrian disappeared. Not literally. He simply withdrew with the brutal decisiveness of a man making a choice he believed necessary and hated. He cancelled 2 personal dinners they had almost allowed themselves to schedule. He shifted conversations back to logistics. He stopped lingering in doorways. By the 3rd day, Claire's anger had outpaced confusion. She found him at dusk in the old reading room of a private club where half the city's powerful men went to pretend history had personally invited them. He stood by the window with resignation papers on the side table and the tired expression of someone who had mistaken noble distance for moral clarity. Claire crossed the room, closed the door behind her, and said, "Absolutely not." Adrian turned slowly. "Claire, no. You do not get to save my building, reform your company, blow up your board, and then decide alone that the final responsible act is vanishing before I can object." He actually looked startled, which was satisfying. "I am not vanishing." Claire pointed at the papers. "That is stationery for vanishing with better typography." For one startled second, Adrian laughed. Then the sound broke and left honesty behind. "If I stay close to you right now, everything good you do risks being narrated through me," he said. "Every promotion, every article, every success. I will not have your life reduced to the consequence of my wanting you." Claire stepped nearer until only the width of one breath remained. "Then stop writing my life without consulting the person living it." The words landed. She saw them land. Adrian closed his eyes briefly as if pain and relief had become impossible to separate. "I love you," he said then, not ceremonially, not as a climax prepared in advance, but like truth finally overruling strategy. "I loved you before I understood it, and badly at first, because I kept trying to protect you in ways that left no room for your choice. I know better now. I also know loving you has made every version of distance feel dishonest." Claire's whole body went still. There it was. The sentence the story had been moving toward since fluorescent hallways and burnt coffee. She touched his face with both hands, feeling the fine tension still held in his jaw, the disbelief under his skin. "Good," she whispered. "Because I'm done being brave around everyone except you." Then she kissed him, not cautiously this time, not in hiding from herself, but with the full, terrifying certainty of a woman who had watched a man choose daylight over convenience and had decided she could trust what remained when the performance burned off. When they finally drew back, the resignation papers still waited on the table. Claire glanced at them once and said, "Now tell me whether those are truly necessary, or just dramatic." Adrian, incredibly, smiled. Possibly both. It was not the end of the fight. But it was the end of the lie that they could survive it apart. In the end, Adrian did not resign that night. He did something harder and far less theatrical. He negotiated. Over the next 3 weeks, the board accepted a governance overhaul, spun off several contested fund relationships, and repositioned Adrian Vale's housing exposure under stricter public impact rules designed so thoroughly that even Jonah from legal described them as unpleasantly admirable. Adrian kept his role, though not untouched. His authority was more transparent now, more accountable, and ironically stronger for having been challenged in public. Claire kept hers as well, and for the first time those roles existed without hidden debt between them. Human Resources, in tones of bureaucratic dignity that fooled no one, acknowledged the new reporting lines and reminded both parties of disclosure responsibilities as if mature adults who had survived scandal, redevelopment warfare, and a near-governance coup might still need a pamphlet to understand boundaries. Inez took one look at the formal guidance packet and said, "Frame it. Future generations should know how hard institutions work to discover that people are inconvenient." Claire laughed so hard she had to sit down. The housing agreement closed in early autumn. Claire's building, along with 3 others, entered the stabilization partnership, preserving existing tenants, funding overdue repairs, and capping displacement pathways that had once been disguised as progress. The work did not fix the city. It did not erase years of quiet damage. But it changed lives in ways that statistics alone could never properly describe. Mrs. Alvarez got her new boiler and immediately complained that the installer lacked manners. Mr. Okafor's shop stayed open under a protected commercial lease. Noah declared victory so enthusiastically that Priya accused him of campaigning for future office. Claire stood on the sidewalk outside her building the morning the final notice was posted, this one announcing preservation, not vacancy, and felt something inside her settle that had been braced for impact so long it no longer remembered how to rest. Adrian arrived 20 minutes later carrying coffee and wearing the expression of a man who knew grand gestures were wasted on a woman currently in love with regulatory success. Claire took the cup, looked at the notice, then at him. "You know," she said, "for someone who began this story by paying a hospital bill in secret, you have become alarmingly pro-paper trail." Adrian's mouth curved. Character development. She leaned into him before she could think better of it. On the stoop, in broad daylight, with Mrs. Alvarez watching from the lobby like a neighborhood surveillance saint, Adrian kissed her softly and without hesitation. Their relationship, once finally allowed to exist in the open, turned out to be less dramatic than the path toward it and infinitely more dangerous for that reason. Drama could be survived on adrenaline. Happiness required staying. Adrian stayed. He learned how Noah took his tea, how Priya weaponized affectionate mockery, how Claire went silent when she was frightened and busier when she was sad. Claire learned Adrian's equivalent details, that grief still found him in hospitals and in spring rain, that he read contracts with a pencil, not a pen, that when he was deeply tired, his restraint loosened enough for a dry, startling wit to appear. They argued, because any honest love between two intelligent adults should occasionally produce sparks. They argued about overwork, about timing, about whether saving everyone in a 10-mile radius counted as a personality or a pathology. But the arguments no longer carried hidden power under them. That changed everything. When Adrian apologized now, it was not from height. When Claire accepted help, it was not under silence. Choice had entered the room and pulled up a chair. In November, Claire repaid the hospital bill. Not to Adrian directly. He would have refused, and more importantly, that was no longer the point. Instead she made a donation of the same amount to St. Catherine's Patient Emergency Fund in Elise Vale's name after asking, and receiving, Adrian's quiet permission. They went together on a grey afternoon that smelled like cold pavement and leaves. The billing office had been repainted since that night. The vending machine was newer. Everything else felt eerily the same. Claire signed the paperwork with steady hands. Adrian stood beside her, not shielding, not directing, simply present. On the way out, they paused in the corridor where they had first spoken. "You were wearing a coat that looked far too expensive for that coffee," Claire said. Adrian glanced down at the polished floor. "You told me crackers counted as dinner under a lenient legal system." She smiled. "It was one of my better lines." He turned to her then, seriousness returning in that unmistakable way of his. "That night I thought kindness meant acting before permission was possible," he said. "You taught me that love means staying long enough to be answered." Claire felt the old ache of that hallway transform into something warmer, steadier, earned. "And you taught me," she said, "that being seen at your worst does not have to end in debt." Adrian touched her cheek, eyes gone soft in the way only she saw often now. "No," he said. "It can begin there, if both people are very stubborn." Winter came. The city glittered. Work expanded. Claire's new department became inconveniently successful, which delighted her and alarmed men who preferred trust to remain decorative. Adrian backed her publicly and disagreed with her when necessary, which proved more romantic than any speech ever could have. Noah's health stabilized enough for him to finish the term he had nearly abandoned. Priya sold the housing photo series to a major magazine and celebrated by taking everyone out for expensive dumplings she insisted were an investment in morale. On the first snowy evening of December, Adrian met Claire outside the bookstore cafe where she had once worried $16 might be the most truthful number in her life. He was standing under the awning in a dark coat dusted white, hands in his pockets, looking both completely composed and faintly uncertain. Claire knew that expression now. It meant he was about to say something that mattered. She walked toward him through the cold, feeling the city move around them in streaks of headlights and breath. Adrian took one look at her and, with all the careful grandeur of a man who had learned honesty the hard way, said, "I don't want rescue, gratitude, secrecy, or caution to be the story anymore." Snow caught in his hair. "I want mornings, inconvenience, shared keys, difficult conversations, and whatever ordinary future we can build without lying to each other." Claire laughed because the proposal was so perfectly him, romantic by way of logistical devotion. "That sounds suspiciously like a life," she said. Adrian stepped closer. "Yes," he answered. "With you, if you want it." Claire reached for his hand, warm even in the cold, and thought of fluorescent hallways, public hearings, hard-earned trust, and every version of love that had nearly missed them before finally getting it right. "I do," she said. Then she kissed him in the snow while taxis hissed past and the city kept going, indifferent and shining and suddenly kind. Much later, when they climbed the stairs to Claire's building with groceries, legal mail, and too many plans for one evening, Mrs. Alvarez opened her door, took one look at them, and declared, "About time." Claire leaned into Adrian's side, laughing, and he bent his head to hers as if home were not a place either of them had been searching for separately all along, but the moment two hard lives finally stopped bracing against love and let it stay.